This episode is brought to you by Active Digital, where we help customer-obsessed companies become destination brands.
So when I think of how I like to interview and when I think of the ways to structure an interview, it's an opportunity to give people a chance to really show their skill sets, especially if you're trying to identify talent that might not be traditional insurance talent.
Your next great hire doesn't necessarily have the background that you're used to looking for, but you can find them, and Derek Greenacre is here with us today to show us how. Do you want to decommoditize your products and services? Do you want to become a destination brand, increase your revenue, and have more control over your pricing? You're in the right place. Each week, we'll talk about how to create great customer experiences and how to orient your company to enable them. We're your hosts, Devin and David, and this is the Experience Leader Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. I am really excited today to have my good friend, Derek Greenacre, on the show. He is the Director of Talent Acquisition at Markel. He has a ton of experience, not only in talent acquisition, but how that actually impacts culture and therefore customer experience. Derek, welcome to the show, man.
Great to be here as always, Devin, and it's great to chat with you. And I think you're emphasizing something that all these things are related. You can't have one without the other. And I think sometimes we miss that point when we think about recruiting and hiring and how we should view talent.
Absolutely. It's a huge part of my framework. You know, I've talked about my 5 forces of CX framework a lot on the show, but culture is a massive part of that. Employee empowerment is a big part. Having the right people on the bus is so crucial. Any business leader, any executive listening to this knows that. Anybody who's ever been a manager listening to this knows that having the right people on the bus is make or break. And hiring the right people is not easy. One of the things I've appreciated about our conversations is, you know, just how awesome your understanding of how to understand somebody and figure out whether they're going to be a good fit, whether they're going to perform well in the role. Can you talk a little bit about your sort of philosophy on how to figure that out?
Yeah, so actually, I'll start a little bit more into how I kind of fell into the insurance industry and people that ultimately believed in me when I first got my start, because I don't know if I had necessarily all the qualifications that they were looking for, but I have my wife's late grandfather was a State Farm agent. I was living out in California where I grew up, and he said to me, "Hey, I think that you would be really good. You've got the ability to sell things, and in the insurance industry is really interesting." And me thinking, as most young kids do, we don't think about, I want to join the insurance industry. It's always got like a stigma about it that, who would want to jump into that? So I said, well, let me take a look at it. I had a lot of respect for him, and he had a long, awesome career. And in the process of going through what that agency process looked like, I thought, man, it'd be really hard to sell something without understanding what it is that I'm selling. So I decided to apply for a job as a bodily injury claim rep for the auto department at State Farm Insurance in the California offices that was local to me. I go through this process of this interview process, and the gentleman who hired me at the time, I kind of went in there saying, I don't have a lot of experience, but I think I can learn. I think I have empathy. I think that I understand what motivates people. I think I understand, I can learn how the legal framework works in civil law and in dealing with auto accidents. And this gentleman who's still a mentor to me today and has since retired, he took a chance on me. And in fact, actually early on, he was very hard on me to be like, no, you've got this, and I'm going to push you into this. It was a wonderful opportunity where he saw something where he thought, yeah, he's lacking on some of the formal experience and the formal qualifications that this role might entail, but he's got that it factor that he's going to be able to go after this role. And kind of, I never looked back. So I started in claims and complex claims and worked my way handling things up through death and dismemberment, which is really a tough line of work. I firmly believe if anybody can get the chance to work in a claims capacity, they should, because you learn a lot. You never know what people are going through. Thankfully, a lot of us don't experience a lot of car accidents or home fires in our lifetime. But when it happens, it's a traumatic event where you come alongside people and you really start to understand what is the value proposition of an insurance policy when you have the ability to bring someone back to that pre-loss condition that they were in. And so I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about how much I really enjoyed the people side of things of, you would investigate how this loss occurred, you would evaluate what the damages are, and then you would negotiate some form of a settlement, whether that's dealing with attorneys if it was more serious or dealing with the person directly and thinking about what is it that you can do to help them get their life back on track. It all sounds, I remember thinking about it when I first got the job of like, this doesn't sound like it's all that complicated, but you'd be surprised what a traumatic event a car, if you've ever been in one, that's not fun, but also you're dealing with people where it's something that doesn't happen all that often. And it gives you an empathy. And then kind of through that process, I worked my way through the insurance industry, which I'm a huge proponent. This industry is amazing. It facilitates business all across the world. A lot of other companies wouldn't be able to take the risks without having the backing of the strong financial backing of the insurance companies that support them in a variety of different product lines. I worked my way over into the underwriting side, eventually went into the learning and development functions of training and thinking about the whole employee experience. Recruitment starts when you first interact with somebody, but really we should think about what does that whole process look like when we pre-board them before they join the organization? What does it look like when we actually get them up and running in their role to make them successful? And then what does career progression look like? And I think all those things have to be firing on all four cylinders in order for us to have the outcomes that we want. I had a former colleague at my last organization who said this to me, that an empty glass can't pour into anything. And so what I find to be so true is that if you silo everything off, if your HR function is an attachment to the side of the business, if your recruitment function is an attachment to the side of the business, you'll never get the outcomes you desire, because I need people who might want to join Markel to see what we're doing here and why it's so special and why they would want to be a part of it, and then how they can bring their unique personality, their unique skills and attributes to help us drive our mission forward to the growth that we want. And so one of the big things that I'm a proponent of is, regardless of the organization you work in, regardless of the industry, if you're in a function that's viewed sometimes as shared services, you should really learn the business and learn how you can articulate the value proposition of that organization. So that's a bit full swing. I never thought I'd be going the direction I went, but it's really just what I enjoy. And so I found a home in the insurance industry. And now more specifically, I specialize in the recruitment space.
Oh, that's very cool. And I mean, really an example, you're kind of like the living testament to the method that you employ to go and find people who may not have the traditional credentials, but wind up being fantastic underwriters. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, I think anybody who's been through an interview process lately, it kind of follows a traditional kind of path. And to some degree, that's good. You want consistency. You want people to have a consistent experience. But a lot of times you'll get some of these competency-based questions that ask something like, tell us a time when, and anybody who's can spin a phrase, they could probably put together some example where they highlight how something went awry and they became the hero that saved the day. And it doesn't necessarily give you information about how a person would add value to your organization. So when I think of how I like to interview, and when I think of the ways to structure an interview, it's an opportunity to give people a chance to really show their skill sets, especially if you're trying to identify talent that might not be traditional insurance talent. I've at times hired people who don't come with risk management and insurance backgrounds. They maybe have like a chemistry background and they can become a cyber underwriter. And you sit there and go, well, how does that stuff kind of align? How does that happen? And it's because there's different ways that they think, and there's ways that they process data, and there's ways that they interact with people that is transferable as a skill. It requires the organization as well to get on board and say, we see some potential here. So when I think of what I want to build in terms of like an interview platform, and you can't do this for every single role, I think about what's end goal? What do I want to get out of this person? Or what do I want to find? And what I don't want to do is, if I were to hire you, Devin, I wouldn't want to say, erase all your past experiences and show up and we'll teach you exactly how we want to do it. It's more so, it's that old Steve Jobs adage, hire smart people and then kind of get out of the way. There are values. A company does have culture, and that's all phenomenal and beneficial. But, there's so much disruption going on in the economy right now. There's so much disruption going on that if you're going to hire people maybe with backgrounds that aren't the traditional candidate, you got to think about what they can bring to the equation and be open to that and welcome them aboard. And so I always think of ultimately what measurables would I need to find here and then structure it accordingly. So for different roles, I mean, really for a claims role, the role that I stepped into, you got to have a lot of empathy. If you don't have empathy, then you're not going to really enjoy the job. You're going to find every person to be kind of burdensome when you're on the phone with them. You just want to get through the day versus trying to understand at the core what's causing that negotiation maybe to slow down, or how can you get that claim closed with it being beneficial to the individual. So that's an example of something that, like, how do you measure for that? And there's a bunch of different methodologies, and I think it's always evolving. I don't think that there's any kind of one-stop shop or there's any one trick that works, and you have to continually evaluate what you're up to. But I think sometimes we're talking around each other when we interview candidates and they give us responses, and we're not really getting to the core of what am I actually looking for. The other thing too, Devin, and I think this is important, is we have a lot of the different biases that enter into the recruitment space. So it's easy that I will hire people that look, act, and sound like me because it's probably people that I'm comfortable being around. So how do I make sure that I'm giving enough of diversity in that interview panel, that I'm having people, really poke at different things of the candidate, and then also that we challenge ourselves, like, do I like this person because maybe he went to the same university as me? Do I like this person because maybe we have some of the same experiences? Or is it actually that I'm assessing accurately the value that they would bring to the organization? And that requires a lot of humility to say, like, I might be missing this, and let me get that second perspective or bring someone else in. So there's so many different thoughts that we could go down that path, but that's just kind of a few initial for you.
No, I think that's fantastic. I think that obviously I appreciate diversity in the workplace. I think that one of the things that I've found is you can have people that all look very different, that come from different parts of the world, et cetera, that still wind up kind of thinking very similarly in our efforts to have diversity that might be based on some immutable characteristics. We wind up not getting diversity of thought. I really love the way that you approach getting people who might not come from the traditional backgrounds, because it sounds like, and at least in my opinion, I'd love to get your take on this, it kind of reinforces or almost guarantees you're going to get diversity of thought, because you're getting people that come from a completely different vantage point than what's typically found in the industry.
Well, I'll give you a couple things. One, obviously, there's a massive amount of people leaving the industry, but also leaving the workforce. We know that baby boomers in the next in a certain number of years, a massive amount of them are retiring because they're at that retirement age. There's not enough that are backfilling. And then you think about people that are in maybe those programs, or that would line them up for a career in insurance. I certainly know when I graduated, I was an international business major, and you couldn't have paid me to go to an insurance company at that age. I was just ignorant to what is actually out there, to how wonderful of an industry it is. So there's that piece of it. So we have to do a better job of articulating to people who could never envision themselves being a part of the insurance industry. We have to do a better job of saying, hey, there's a place for you here. And then, so that's first of all, whereas the industry, it's an old industry. Lloyd's of London started a long time ago insuring ships going across the ocean. And so there's a massive history there. And a lot of people, they fell into it because they knew a family member that was in it. And so you get a little bit of that nepotism going on as well, that doesn't always help from saying, hey, people who aren't traditionally, either haven't been in this industry, like, welcome. That's hard to say when you're looking around and going, man, all those people with the same last name work here. So you do have a little bit of that going on. But then I also think that the other thing that's potentially accelerating this is we've seen a lot of tech startups. We've seen a lot of people say, specifically in the insurance industry, there's an expense associated with placing insurance. There's too many intermediaries potentially involved in insurance. There's not enough technology being used in insurance. So you have, the Googles of the world, they perk up their head and go, like, how can we come in and disrupt this? And so I think a lot of insurance companies, to their credit, and Markel is no exception to this, are looking at, we want to be the disruptors, disrupt ourselves where we need to, go into markets that are emerging so that we can be the ones that capitalize on these opportunities. And we can do it from the strength of our almost 100-year history of being a phenomenal insurance carrier, and take that kind of legacy knowledge, but then apply it to the future generations and the future emerging risks that we can't even anticipate. I mean, there's a lot of stuff now that people get insurance for that nobody imagined 15, 20 years ago that have just blown up completely. And I mean, Devin, you see it in your space, technology, it kind of grows exponentially. I always think of that old adage, we started flying in 1903, put a man on the moon in 1969. That's a very short amount of time to go from not being airborne to getting into space. And I think we see that across all different industries. So you have that disruption. And then finally, I'd actually say the third thing that I've seen that's probably been a positive out of a pandemic, if you can say that, is that a lot of companies immediately overnight had to shift to the virtual world. Prior to that, organizations would say, we can't do that, we can't do that. And then when necessity showed up, we found ways to do that. I think what that did is that kind of recalibrated the employee-employer relationship. What does the work-life balance, or I heard a phrase the other day called work harmonization. What does that look like? Because the lines are definitely getting blurry. As I sit, I'm looking at, I'm in my bedroom where my office is because that's just the configuration I have at home. I personally like to get into the office because it gets me away from children that like to disrupt my deep thoughts, as deep as those can be. But what it did is it got organizations that potentially it accelerated. We saw that trend of maybe the way we think about work life and the way that technology can enhance work life balance, that accelerated it. And you saw a lot of people too, and that's why the market's been so hot in recent time. That they had this, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. You had a lot of things locked down. Everybody's wondering what's going on here, and you're sitting and you're looking at the same screen every day. So people would get frustrated because a lot of things that were maybe part of their normal routine had been stripped away. So the one thing they could change was they could change their organizations. And then they realized when they got to the new organization that maybe the grass wasn't greener necessarily. Or now I'm looking at the same screen, but just with a different logo. And so it then started to really, I think, prompt a lot of HR departments to think about, okay, what is this holistic employee experience that we need to think about? Because we're not going to innovate products and we're not going to progress the way we want to if we're not meeting the needs of the employee. And I think that's a positive byproduct of an otherwise terrible pandemic, is that it actually caused us all to take a step back and say, like, what are we doing and does it make sense? And if not, we need to change, and we need to change a lot faster. And Markel absolutely adhered to that and started to make those changes. And we've continued to evaluate, what needs to stay and what needs to go. And I think now the beauty of it is that conversation will be at the forefront regularly, versus that was something it was a little bit lower on the list. Revenue generating is the first thing, reducing expenses is kind of the second. And then you get way down the line of all these other things that a lot of companies I think were potentially missing out on.
Absolutely, man. I think that we often put employee experience too far down the list. If we really could quantify, which I do think it's quantifiable. I've given some stats on the show before. A big piece of employee experience is purpose, right? Why does the company exist? And therefore, how do I contribute to that purpose? Do I care about that purpose? How does that align to my own story, what I want to do in life? It affects how much somebody puts into their work. Employees who have a sense of purpose, they put in 4 times the amount of loyalty, the amount of pride, the amount of really identity with their work. The Stengel 50, these organizations that have a clear sense of purpose, their employees were 4 times more likely to say, my work is not just a job, that it has a higher purpose to that. And I think they were 11 times more likely to stay with the company when that company had a high sense of purpose. That's just one aspect of the employee experience. It really is a part of the company brand, but people don't often think about how that affects the employee and how much it affects what they get out of them, and therefore the level of excellence and customer experience they're able to deliver to the market as a result.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're spot on. I think at times we want to be valued for our humanity. So for me, when I think of somebody that I'm engaging for a position, or not even that, it's just anybody that I work with, they're a living, breathing human in front of me, and they have value regardless of what they can offer. And I think it's at times we all get busy, and as organizations, we have shareholders to keep happy, and that we forget that the people that really make it go, that if we don't validate their humanity and if we don't understand their value proposition, proposition, then they won't stick around. And sometimes that's the other thing too with recruiting. And in my opinion of it is I want to help someone figure out if they align with what we're up to here at Markel. I know that I align with it. I know that we have amazing people. I know that we have a vision and a purpose that I love and I'm excited to be a part of. But like, it never hurts my feelings when someone says, I don't know if I'm in full alignment with that. I say, that's okay. Find where your bent is. Find what you're really passionate about. Or let me get you some contacts from other people that I know that are always hiring, because you kind of remind me of this person over at that broker, or you remind me of this person at this other carrier. I don't worry about it as much, because I think that ultimately if I really push hard to hire that person, then I'm not helping them find what's going to bring purpose to their work life. And then probably give them that work-life balance or that work-life harmonization that they're looking for. And, it was funny. I've heard our CEO, who's retiring next year, Richie Witt, he was talking about how over the 30 years that he's been at Markel, he identifies that people who value winning as a team above maybe winning for on their own are ones that seem to do really well at Markel. And I'm like, man, you can distill that down of like, what joy do you get when you as a team crosses the finish line together? And those people tend to be successful. And when we hire people where maybe they become a little bit more about how do I progress my own career, or how do I make sure that my name's on the top of the memo line, that I achieved whatever success that can be tangibly in front, those people tend to struggle. And so for me, the whole idea of recruiting is identifying like, what is your value proposition and what is Markel's value proposition? And if those two things are in alignment, we got to get you here. If they're not in alignment, that's okay. That's for you as the employee to figure out, where do you want to go? I mean, that's for us to either figure out, do we have the right company culture? Do we have the right, we call it the Markel style, and it is amazing. And the bigger thing is to make sure that it sustains. Are we getting that out to the marketplace, and are we honoring what we committed to in that Markel style? I have it sitting here on my desk, and it's something that we like to put up and before meetings to make sure that that's something that's prominent and it's at the foreground, that's what we're going to live by. And if we're not doing that, then that's on us to fix, because it means we're not living up to what standard we hold. And if people notice that, they're going to leave. It's kind of plain and simple. But also there are people who might look at it and go, that's not what I want to be a part of. And I go, okay, no problem. And then let's save a lot of heartburn and help you find whatever that looks like. And who knows, down the road, I mean, I don't know about you, Devin, but I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. The evolution of my own career, of what I never thought I would want to do versus when I learned more about myself as to what actually motivates me, what actually gives me purpose in my work, that's going to shift. And if you treat people well in that recruitment process, even if they tell you I'm not interested, you never know when they're going to come back and say, actually, the more I think about it, this is something I want to be a part of. And I think that that's important.
Absolutely, man. That is so cool, because what I really feel like you did there is you outlined, and this is one of the reasons I think you're great at what you do, is you took input from leadership on the direction and the culture of the company, and you found a way to systematize that into your recruiting efforts so that you make sure that you select for the kind of people who are going to fit in to the culture. I think that's fantastic. I think that that's something that folks should take away from this is when you have those things in place, when you have purpose set in place, that empowers your folks in HR to be able to bring people in who are going to be the right people to go on the bus with you to where you're trying to get. I think that it's amazing to have the clarity to say, okay, that person said something to me that is a big deal. People who want to win on a team are a great fit here. I need to take that and find a way to select for that in the recruiting process so that everybody that I'm putting in front of a hiring manager is a Markel person or is a potentially high candidate for being a Markel person. I love that. I'm interested in, you talked about how the pandemic has changed work in some ways and changed the way that people look at work. We talked about the fact that employees have a greater sense of agency in where they work, how they work, et cetera. How has that changed how you've had to go and get people in the talent market?
First of all, I do want to go back to one thing and then I'll answer that. But the reason I was sold on Markel was the fact that, everything you talked about, the way that we listened to our leadership and the way that we partner was what sold them on me coming across, is that this is something that's embodied in the whole culture. So I joined this team, and the talent acquisition team is phenomenal. And they really they're all bought into, we want to bring the best people to Markel, and we want to be partners with our key stakeholders. So it is that kind of that shared vision and that shared purpose. And that's what really sold me on Markel, to be honest, because I thought this is something that I'd love to be a part of. So first of all, there's that. In terms of the agency question, I think that what happened, and this happened for, I think, a lot of us, and Devin, you and I are having these conversations as we got to know each other through the earlier parts of the pandemic, is I think everybody took a step back to reassess, what am I doing with my life? Do I have my priorities in order? When we got all this extra time because we weren't commuting, or when different things got canceled and we saw the impact that it had on ourselves, on our families, it brought things maybe that bubbled up to say, okay, like this is something that needs attention, whether it was your relationships. I know for me, I've got 4 young children, and when school was shut down and turned to virtual, the impact it had on 2 of them versus the other 2, they loved it, and how that changed and how we had to then interact with them. And I'm grateful. My wife is a saint in terms of, she really led that charge to make sure that they had the stability that we'd had before. But what I think happened is a lot of people said, I'm no longer going to compromise. I'm not going to put up with certain things that I have in the past. And I am going to start listening to that still small voice that's telling me I should go try this, or that maybe I'm willing to sacrifice some salary from it for some additional freedom, or that, if a company's not willing to make some accommodations, then I'm really not a part of that vision and purpose moving forward. I'm going to actually shut off on vacation, or I'm going to make more time to visit my family and relatives and stuff like that. And so there was almost a bit of that. And I don't think this is surprising to anybody. I think we all felt it. I think we're all still kind of feeling with it, and then trying to assess, what does it mean to come back to the office? And you've seen different headlines of some people say you can be virtual now forever. And then you have other companies that say you're coming in full time now forever. And everybody's trying to figure out what's that kind of right balance. But I think to your question on agency, a lot of people just said there are certain things that I used to compromise on that are no longer negotiable. And as a result, when I go into any sort of job, that's either going to be there, or I'm going to find another way to restructure my life. And if companies don't get on board with that, they're going to have a tough time hiring. And we saw a lot of organizations try to figure that balance out. The one thing I will say, I'm not fully sold on let's just be remote all the time. I think that there's a risk there. I think that when we think of young talent, when we think of company culture, that you have to be careful. The old adage, if you're going to remove a fence, you might want to question why it was there in the first place, in terms of I need to learn from people that have gone down that path before me to figure out what skills and experience I need to have in order to get to those roles later on, as they maybe move into retirement or other positions, and as we backfill. So that's an important thing, because I remember I was talking to one manager who was saying, he had traveled his whole career and he knew all the stakeholders in that organization. And he said, well, I don't know if I need to go back into the office as much. And I responded to him, I actually think you do, because there are other people that need to learn from you, that need to spend time having those collision points where they run into you and they have a conversation that they otherwise wouldn't have had because they ran into you. Now, the big disruption you have is, okay, if I've got a question for somebody, well, I'll just see if I can catch them at the end of the day, or I'll put something on the calendar. I can't run into them at the water cooler or filling up coffee or whatever. And I lose a sense of what is my organization anymore, because I used to see it, touch it, feel it. So I do think that hasn't been fully fleshed out. And that's why you're seeing with a lot of people, while they gained a lot of agency and the employee had a lot more power in that negotiation, I think you're also starting to see a trend the other way, where potentially employees are saying, I might have gotten rid of some stuff that wasn't actually the problem and was actually something I very much valued, or maybe I do want to get into the office a little bit more. So I think there's more to come on that. I'll be really interested to see how that plays out. But I caution any organization from just making the knee-jerk, let's rip the Band-Aid off, without thinking through what all the potential consequences are and what you lose in the process.
Yeah, I will say myself that just over the last 2 years, 2.5 now, I suppose, being primarily remote, I've discovered that I don't like being remote 100% of the time. At the time, I had only experienced what it was like to be remote part of the time. I had the flexibility at the last several companies I've worked at, to come in or not come in based on what I needed to do or what we needed to accomplish. And, I did that, but I found that, I wanted to see people, right? As much as I hated the commute, I wanted to see people. You're totally right about the water cooler conversation. When you're at home, that stuff doesn't happen. Everything has to be put on the calendar in order for it to happen. Unless, people are using, there are ways that you can try to simulate that. For instance, Slack has a feature where you can you can be in a huddle and, you can kind of turn it into a lounge where people can just come in. You can try to create that. But, it's very new to people. So people aren't, doing that a ton. I'm sure there are some, there are some innovative cultures out there where they're trying to employ every tool necessary, right, to try to maintain some of that culture or to build that culture, for a new company and to still allow for people to be 100% remote. I think that you're absolutely right. For folks who are just entering into the workforce, there is something lost in not being able to be in person with their colleagues and to be able to sort of see the culture without necessarily having to be directly in a meeting or directly interacting with somebody. There's a lot less that you can just see in passing or passively than if you're there in person. So I agree with you. I would absolutely caution companies to be careful about being too ideological about, going the 100% remote route. I've definitely seen the impact of it, and not all of it is good in my opinion. Granted, that's my opinion. There's some folks who love being 100% remote, do not want to go into an office, and they're productive. They knock it out of the park. And I think that finding ways to make sure that people can still connect and still absorb the culture without being in person are absolutely critical in those moments. And I think that the higher you get up on the corporate ladder, if you will, the more difficult it is, in my opinion, to lead effectively without having those things in place or, being in person at least part of the time. That's a very interesting thing there, because it's something that just within the last few months I've been realizing I really need to get out of the house and get around my coworkers, because I miss being able to be in the same room, feed off of their energy, be able to really get to know people. It's a big deal.
Learn by osmosis, where they're actually you just around them to hear the conversations they're having. So I think I can sum it up. There's kind of two competing thoughts that I think are part of this discussion. One, humans are relational. They like to be around each other. We just have a different connection. When I see a picture of my kid versus when I actually see him, there's a difference. And so, that's why even with things like FaceTime, it's good, but it's just different than seeing, touching, feeling. So there's that piece of it. And I think that I don't think that that's changing anytime soon. In fact, the last few times that I've been with my team, you can just notice there's a difference, that you feel a connection that's just different than we're all kind of isolated and the organization is out there in some ether, just kind of hanging on its own. But then the other side, so I'll flip the other end of the coin, is that I think that there was, for a long time, a lack of trust in organizations of what employees are actually up to. And that was a bit of a trend where it was like, we want to make sure we see you at the desk, that you're putting the time in. I had a friend of mine who she came up through a law firm in the early days, and law firms are their own cultures. And you and I, Devin, have a good friend that's told us stories where she told me a story about how what she would do is before she would leave to go home, she would open up a Coke can and put it on her desk to make it look like she was just coming right back, so people would assume that she was going to be back at her desk, like putting in the long hours. I think this is a positive change, that I have employees that go, I've got a kid that I need to take somewhere middle of the day. It's like, yeah, great, go for it. The flexibility, even for me today, the ability to be at home because of some things that I had to take care of this afternoon, that's something that just wasn't there before. Everything was locked down. The systems were only inside the building. Sometimes it felt like an act of Congress to be able to ask for a day off, or you had to make sure all this type of workforce planning, versus being able to say that for me, sometimes it's a matter of, I'm going to go to my kid's baseball game or soccer or whatever, and then I'm going to come back and log in later when it's a little bit quieter, because Devin, my kids, they're not very quiet. and I'm gonna log in later when it fits me to get some critical time to think. Or I like to be really early in the morning, where before everybody's woken up, that I can get a few things done, and it gets my day off to a better footing. I think all that flexibility gets back into that concept of that work harmonization, not work-life balance, because that's what was thrown out of whack, is that you had, all of a sudden we all came home and all of our work stuff is now at home, and companies adjusted and we're all at home, and we felt like the lines are getting really blurry. Whereas maybe what we need to do is sit back for a second and say, okay, what is the right balance and how do we make it harmonize? Where maybe I'm okay with if in the middle of the day I need to take care of something, that I can come back and handle work in the evening if that's something that's available for me. A lot of work to be done there. It obviously is not true about every single role out there or every single position. And that's the thing you have to be careful of, is you don't want to create a situation where you have some employees that can have that kind of flexibility and others that can't, just by the nature of the job that they're doing. But that was kind of the positive. But both of those things are true. They're not mutually exclusive. Like, we are relational simultaneously as we desire flexibility and autonomy. And so if you want to know what keeps someone working at a job for a long time and advancing through an organization, it's autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy says I run my day. Mastery says I'm able to become a technical specialist at something. And purpose says that my contribution, the whole, is better than the sum of the parts, that my contribution matters, that if I was gone, the company would notice it. And so if you can put those three things together, you'll have very happy employees and you'll have a very wonderful culture. And I think that that's where a lot of the work has to go right now.
That's awesome, man. I really appreciate the perspective you have on this, just because of where you sit and the function of the business. One of the other questions I have is really around, what are you doing now in this new landscape? What are you doing now to get out there and find talent? Are conferences back? Like, is that like a main mechanism? Like, how are you going out and getting people out there?
Yeah, well, first of all, conferences are back, but I do think that it's also about, because there's just not enough, I would call it, traditional talent to fill the roles that are coming available, or the growth plans that certainly Markel has, but probably the industry as a whole. There's a massive need for insurance. There's a need for capacity out there. So I think the other thing too is to identify different pipelines, to identify skill sets and attributes that can be molded and cultivated. So I work a lot with our L&D partners. Devin, as you know, my previous capacity, I was much more involved on the learning and development side, to think about how can we take someone who has some amazing capabilities and mold them into what we're looking for, while also keeping the things that they're bringing that are different, so that they can challenge us in a healthy manner. That's a big challenge. I think that the experience starts much earlier. I mean, we're thinking about how do we do stuff with high schoolers, and then think about how would we support them in college, and how do we make sure that our internship programs are set up in a way that we can have a really good throughput to bringing people on full time at Markel. But, who is that talent, and how do we articulate that actually this is a really good place for you, where maybe you don't have all the connections that people who have traditionally come into this industry have? I'm cautious as I talk about this, because Markel, we have a phenomenal culture, but the insurance industry as a whole has that reputation. And I think that for us to push through that, we have to be honest about potentially how others feel about our industry. And we have to acknowledge it and say, hey, maybe this hasn't been the most diverse industry. I mean, that's kind of an understatement right there. So how do we start living that? How do we start saying the right things, but then having our actions align with that? And so for me, it's also, I think for a lot of us, it's acknowledging that maybe we don't know those answers and we have to start trying something different. We need to be a little bit more bold in the direction we head, because I think historically, insurance is a risk averse. Like, we want to take on good risks. We want to insure companies that have good risk controls. We want to make sure that we're prudent in our underwriting process. And sometimes that bubbles over into everything else. That versus you look at some of the most innovative companies, it's that they're willing to kind of swing for the fences and realize that there could be some potential losses there. I think that that's always the hard part, is to be bold. But I think right now, I mean, the industry, as well as Markel specifically, it's ripe for that kind of innovation where we're realizing that the world is changing rapidly. And we think about our own history from where we started to what we are today. And it's massively different. I mean, we've evolved so much over that time, and that's a powerful story. I just think the pace of change is going to come a lot faster. And we need to make sure that as an organization and as a culture that we're ready for that. Because if we're not and someone else is, it's going to be problematic. But if we are, and I actually think we weathered the storm better than a lot of other organizations, is that we were more innovative on the front end, but also our culture sustained and the values that we have sustained during that time to where we've been very strong through that process. I'm newer to Markel, so I'm learning all that, but that's what drew me into the fold. And that's what really gets me excited about it, that I'm seeing that we're living by what we state. Our actions reflect our words. And I think that those types of cultures are going to win out, even though what we look like in 10 years will be massively different. I mean, we know roles that we're currently doing and the way that we're doing them are going to shift over time. So we have to be proactive to think about what that looks like.
That's awesome. And, it hits on something that you said earlier that I thought was really key, is that you try to look at how you need to disrupt yourself to maintain market position, to remain innovative. I'm not asking you to give away any trade secrets here, but, I will ask, just for you personally, how do you go about keeping yourself in that frame of mind?
So I think we can draw on a lot of our own experiences. For me, so that gentleman I mentioned at the beginning from State Farm who hired me, he and I had a lot of conversations that were very humbling around ways that maybe I wasn't living up to what I was stating that my values were. I think that it requires that we step back and evaluate, am I honoring my commitments in the way that I set out to? And I was taught from a very young age that you can only control what you can control. You can't always control what others are doing to you. But I'm surprised by how much I will reflect on things and go, I didn't handle that as well as I could have. And it's my job to go reconcile that. And it's my job to step up and say, hey, this was something that I could do better. And how much trust you gain from people when you're willing to own your own garbage. And it creates a culture of accountability. So, for me, I think that what do you have to lose if you turn the microscope on yourself as an organization to say, hey, we're not really good at X. So how do we either get better at it, or do we just identify that people that desire this are not going to like it here? You could go both directions. I think about that in my own relationships of there's some things I'm just, I'm not going to be. And it's humbling at times because I think we all want to be really good at a lot of different things. But I can hire people that can support me in that. My team can have diverse skill sets where collectively together we achieve better than we would on our own. I mean, there's so many ways to look at that. And I think over time, I've gotten more comfortable with my own deficiencies, which has helped me kind of sharpen what my strengths are. And when you kind of call it out, it takes the power away from it. It allows you to kind of press boldly into trying things because you're doing it from a much more humble perspective. So I do think it's a lot of stepping back and really, like, if you've done something, or if I have an interaction where I think, ooh, I don't like how that went, bring it up with the person. Don't be afraid of what the implications are for you. Control what you can control, and you'll help create a culture that you love. And that's what I love is all the people that I work with, they embody that. And it makes for a very amazing culture where you go like, yeah, I can be a part of this. I can actually I hear this whole adage of I can bring my true self to work. And that means so many different things to so many different people. But what I think it is you can just be authentic and you don't have to sugarcoat who you are. And that's what I love. And I don't ever want to be a part of or create a culture where people think that they do have to hide that. So I'd rather let's all just be open and direct with that. But that requires me doing that with myself first.
I love that, man. I love that. They are very blessed to have you on the crew over at Markel, man. I think that some of the things that you've said here, obviously extremely helpful for our audience. All right, so I have one last thing that I want to touch on as we head out here. I know that you are a voracious reader. So in 30 seconds, can you tell everybody what you're reading right now that is worth picking up?
I just actually finished the book called The Power of Regret by Daniel Pink. And if you haven't read his stuff, he's very good. But The Power of Regret he talks about how people how they have regrets in their lives and how they can channel that to make better decisions in the future. It's a very interesting book. I'm not sure I agree with all of his premises, but I think it's definitely worth picking up and checking out. I just finished it as I've been, I did audiobook on that one and it was very enjoyable.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, dude, I think that you have given us so much to think about here. I hope everybody has the opportunity to go back, listen to this again, share it with your HR department. And, I think that the things that are happening in the market now are only going to accelerate, as Derek said. So very valuable insight to take into that changing environment. So, folks, thank you so much for listening. As always, keep outserving your competition on your relentless pursuit to become an experienced leader. Derek, thanks for being on, and everybody, thanks for listening.